Hello and welcome to section 11.3. This is going to be about cycles. We talked about energy and how energy flows through an ecosystem. If you don't remember anything in science, always remember energy is conserved and matter is conserved. It doesn't get created or destroyed, it is conserved. But in an ecosystem, energy flows through it. When we talk about matter in ecosystems, matter cycles through an ecosystem. It continues to be reused in that ecosystem. And carbon dioxide, oxygen, and nitrogen are actually, those are reused on very large scale global cycles. There are other elements, phosphorus and sulfur, they go through cycles as well, but they are not so large scale. They tend to be a little closer to local areas. So we're going to talk about three of them. We're going to look at carbon dioxide, oxygen, and nitrogen, and how those compounds are cycled through ecosystems. Let's first look at the carbon cycle. And we're going to look at the carbon cycle in relation to carbon dioxide. We're going to look at CO2. And if we can first think of how carbon dioxide, we have a lot of this in our atmosphere, in the biosphere, and it gets used in the biosphere, that place where life exists on Earth, remember. That gets used by plants via photosynthesis, right? We have photosynthetic autotrophs. Remember, autotrophs means organisms that make their own food. Photosynthetic autotrophs are organisms that they make their own food via photosynthesis. So if we have a plant, something that photosynthesizes, it is using the CO2 in the atmosphere. It's taking that out of the atmosphere, where it then converts that into organic compounds. Some of that will remain in the body of that plant or the autotroph. Some of it will be consumed by consumers, and if a consumer then were to eat the carbon out of there, then it would use that carbon in its body as well. And so we have that cycle of different organisms obtaining the carbon from the autotrophs. If you think about when either autotrophs or heterotrophs die, the carbon from their bodies ends up decomposing, and decomposers will then utilize that carbon. The death of those organisms will eventually end up potentially being used as fossil fuels, such as oil, coal, gas. That, if it is burned by humans via combustion, right, re-releases that CO2 into the atmosphere. The other way the CO2 gets re-released back into the atmosphere would be cell respiration. And we have cellular respiration going on with all kinds of organisms. We have the photosynthetic autotrophs also carry out a little bit of cell respiration that releases CO2 back into the atmosphere. Obviously, the heterotrophs, they release CO2 back into the atmosphere, and so do decomposers through their cell respiration processes. CO2 is re-released back into the atmosphere. Now, this is a very simplified version of the process. It gets a little bit more complex. These are the main points for you to know. Volcanic activity re-releases CO2 back into the atmosphere. We have CO2 basically taking part in the weathering of rocks as well. We have biological and chemical processes that take place with CO2 through the oceans and through different ecosystems in the oceans as well. But this is pretty much the simplified version of how the carbon cycle works. Now let's take a look at the nitrogen cycle. Just a little transitional note, all photosynthetic autotrophs can fix carbon. They can take that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and use it to create different organic compounds, but most organisms cannot use nitrogen gas. nitrogen gas looks like this, two nitrogen atoms bonded together. Only certain prokaryotic soil bacteria can convert nitrogen in the atmosphere into ammonia. And here we have this gaseous atmospheric nitrogen out in the biosphere here. And certain bacteria that are in the soil use that nitrogen and convert it into ammonia. And then other bacteria use that ammonia and convert it into nitrites and then nitrates. That complete process of taking the ammonia and eventually getting nitrates out of it is called nitrification. And it's a very important process that these prokaryotic organisms provide. Plants, here we have some examples of a few plants back here. They can absorb either the ammonia or the nitrate or nitrites from the soil or the water, and they can use that to synthesize different nitrogen-containing compounds like amino acids and nucleotides. If you remember all these organic compounds that we've been talking about all year long, amino acids have to have nitrogen, and so do nucleotides. So they take that from the plants, can use that from the soil, those compounds from the soil, and then use those for amino acids and nucleotides. Then consumers and decomposers, the only place they can get their nitrogen would be from other organisms. That is the only place that consumer or all the other consumers can get their nitrogen. Some more processes here. We have those nitrates go through a process called denitrification. So remember, we have nitrification where the ammonia is converted into nitrates. We have denitrification where we take the nitrates, that is converted back into the N2, the nitrogen gas, via other bacteria in the soil, and that happens there. So a few more aspects that affect our simplified version of the nitrogen cycle here, and one that's really important is lightning right here. Lightning allows gaseous nitrogen to be oxidized and contributes huge amounts of nitrate to the soil and water. So we get that occurring through the lightning. Also, fossil fuels, the burning of fossil fuels add nitrates to the soil as well. Another place that we get ammonia and nitrates also is from fertilizers that leach down into the soil. So that is our nitrogen cycle. Now let's take a look at our last cycle, the water cycle. It's obviously incredibly important to all living organisms, H2O, our water cycle. And here's a really simplified version of that. We have precipitation and we have evaporation. We have precipitation, we have evaporation that happens in our water cycle. So remember that simply as our simple basis for cycling water. Now let's look at a few more details to this cycle. Okay, well, we have our basic cycle here of the precipitation coming down from the atmosphere and the evaporation over here. There are a few more important points to make about this. The vast majority of the water returning into the atmosphere is through evaporation, especially over the oceans. A huge amount of evaporation occurs and returns the water into the atmosphere. However, other processes also contribute to the return of water to the atmosphere. One would be cell respiration, and I drew a human right here, but all organisms carry out cell respiration. That is returning water to the atmosphere. Also, this big fancy word, evapotranspiration, has to do with transpiration that happens in plants. You might wonder, what is that? Well, think about a plant. There's a huge amount of water that is lost through all of the surface area of all of the all of the autotrophs, all of the photosynthesizing autotrophs on the planet. Transpiration refers to the waters that is lost through the surface area of the bodies of those plants, the leaves and the stems and everything. So we have a tiny bit of sublimation, if you're wondering what that word is. That is where solid water in the form of ice or snow is immediately converted into gas. It passes right through that liquid stage and is converted directly into a gas phase. So the water here is sublimating. So this is more of a complete picture of a lot of things that are going on in the water cycle. So that brings us to our last subject in this section, and that is limiting factors. Limiting factors, obviously, the populations of ecosystems are limited by certain factors. And we're going to talk a little bit more in the next section about populations and about dynamics, but I'd like you to just be thinking about different limiting factors. What kinds of things would limit populations in ecosystems? And water definitely limits populations. That probably comes to mind first. A population could be limited by lack of heat or lack of nutrients in the soil. It could be limited, here's obviously limited by water, lack of water. It could be limited by maybe the productivity of the insects. This population could be limited by the productivity of the population of another organism. In turn, the limitations of this population might affect another population within that ecosystem as well. So just be thinking about different kinds of limiting factors that will keep populations from continued growth within an ecosystem. So here are the main points to remember. Remember, energy flows through an ecosystem, but matter cycles through an ecosystem. Remember to review those different cycles: carbon, nitrogen, water. Make a good diagram of one of those. Look at how you can explain those yourself by drawing out some diagrams of those cycles. And remember our concept of limiting factors. If you'd like some advanced ideas, here are a couple more to research, and I look forward to seeing you in class.